Morgen Rochard, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, Henry.
Okay, so I've followed your work and followed you on Twitter for a few years now, and I remember when I first found you, I couldn't believe there was a financial advisor who recommended Bitcoin, and that always stuck out to me as really unique. And so, getting the chance to talk to you about that is great. So, first question though is two-part personal question. My brother's name is Morgan. So my first question is, do people think you're a guy before they meet you? Because they always think he's a girl. And then secondly, how did your parents choose the E instead of the A?
Oh, this is actually a great story. So, yes, people always think that I'm a guy. I get referred to as Mr. Rochard quite often. And the funny thing about being Mr. Rochard is because I'm married to Pierre, I'm like, are they actually talking about Pierre? Or like,
Right.
did they need to email him, or is it, or like, did they actually mean me? And sometimes I actually get Pierre and I. People think that we're brother and sister, which I think is kind of funny too. That's not part of your question. But yeah, people misgender me all the time. Not that it's a big deal. And the E is actually because so my maiden name had didn't have any A's in it, and so when my mother and father had picked the name Morgan, they decided that that it would look nicer because of the E that my first name had an E, and this actually gave me a complex growing up as a kid because I saw other kids' names with A's in it, and I was like, I'm weird. Like, I don't have any A's in my name anywhere. And A is a very common letter. And so, like, in my head, from age kindergarten when I started reading till I was, like middle school, like, I can't believe it. I'm even saying this out loud. I actually, like, thought about this a lot of, like,
I
how many
bet.
kids had A's in their name versus me, who was kind of weird with only E's, and whether or not people were thinking about this. So, all to say that we decided to name our kids very generic, easy names to spell with the spelling that people normally use for them so that this would never happen to them.
So you corrected back.
Yeah, exactly. So like my son is Alex, my daughters are Mary and Eve. I mean, it's just like you can't mess those up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Simple, easy to hear, easy to spell. I like that. How old are your kids?
I've got a 6-year-old boy, a 3-year-old girl, and an almost 1-year-old girl. So yeah.
Oh wow, really nice. You guys went
Yeah,
for
they're
the
good kids.
went for the three. I feel like that's a
We
big
did, yeah.
decision, 2 to 3.
Honestly, I thought it would be hard because going from 1 to 2, I felt was very difficult. But once you're there, it's like you can add as many kids as your household can tolerate. You know,
Yeah.
it's like
Th-
somebody described it to me as pouring a cup of water in an ocean, right? It's like what's one
yeah.
more cup, you know?
That's true. You're like already screwed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There was my wife listened to this, I think a Freakonomics podcast or something though, about why like you have to switch from an SUV or a car to a minivan if you go from 2 to 3, and how that's
Okay.
like limiting population growth in some way. Um, did you guys go for the minivan?
We went for the minivan early on. I always
Okay,
knew I
that's
wanted to
why.
be a minivan mom. Yeah. And so when we moved to Austin, I was like, let's just go for it. Let's get a used minivan and let's like run this car into the ground. And my
Yep.
favorite example actually of this minivan was like, I don't care about this car at all. Like it's literally this car is close to free. And we took it to an outdoor zoo where like animals actually ram into your car and they come up to the window and they ask for food like to the window of your car. And if I had been driving any other car, I would have been like, this is like, I think I actually would have had a panic attack. But because our car is like this free garbage minivan that we drive our kids around in, I'm like, great, ram our car. Nobody cares. Like, as long
That's
as it still
amazing.
drives, it's cool. Yeah.
That's awesome. All right, so let's get back to the Bitcoin financial advisor stuff you work on. So I'm like again, I see it as such a unique position you're in. So I'm curious, what were the steps in your career and your life that have made you a Bitcoin slash financial advisor?
Yeah, so I didn't have the typical upbringing I think that people have in America where their parents are either, Democrats or Republicans. And so there were politics that were discussed in our household, but like my parents were Ross Perot voters, right? Like that's who my parents are. And so, and like they're still this day, like, they tend to be more on the right side of things than the left side, but like, they they're more into Malay than they are into, other politicians. And so
Hmm.
with that as your upbringing of like, okay, the government's not here as your helper, right? The government's here to like take their tax money and annoy you. And my dad was a business owner. My mom helped run his business. So like they were constantly annoyed by regulations and other things. Like you hear this stuff growing up and you don't think like, wow, the government's great. Like they're really
Hmm.
this, who's going to solve all of our problems. And so with that in mind, like I read some Ayn Rand in high school and got really into that. And then in college, started reading economics books. And so, like, started with Keynesian and then ended up, reading Mises and Rothbard and Huelsman. And so that's kind of how I just kept kind of going down that path. I was a gold bug definitely for a while, but then got my first job in finance. And then I was trying to reconcile like the stuff that I'd learned with like what I was seeing in finance. And it was very difficult for me actually because like my brain couldn't really make sense of it. And I was like, okay, I guess practically I have to do these things, but like ideologically I want to do those things. And so I just felt very conflicted, but was working with clients at some point in my career and just felt like, okay, well, this is just how we do things. So I got very steeped into traditional finance, but always kind of had in the back of me like that libertarian soul,
Hmm.
And so when I finally learned about Bitcoin, it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so it wasn't really a question. It was just sort of like, yeah, that makes sense. I should probably go buy some of that. And then I tried to buy
Wow.
some of it, and I couldn't. Like, I couldn't figure out how to do it, which is
Yeah.
kind of funny. I mean, you had to wire money to Japan. It was like Mount Gox at the time. It seemed like after, especially having been in traditional finance for so long, I think if I hadn't been in traditional finance, I probably would have wired money to Japan because I wouldn't have known any better. But at that point, I was like, I've done international wires, and this something here is fishy. And so I just forgot about it and didn't do anything with it again. And then I met Pierre about 11 years ago now. And of course, he was like talking about Bitcoin on our first date. And I was like, oh, I remember that thing. I read about that on like Mises.org and I tried to buy some of that and I never did, And so. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but I wouldn't say I was like orange pilled. So I think people often think like, oh, you have one conversation with somebody and they're orange pilled. That's actually not how it was for me. Like Pierre talked to me about it and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And I bought some, whatever, and I didn't really think about it. But I wasn't all in, I wasn't like, this is the world reserve currency. Like I didn't have
Yeah.
that same, I guess, I didn't have the same vision that I would say my husband had back then. Like he could really see where it was going and where it still is going. Whereas like back then I was like, whatever, like I'll just put a little bit of money on it, diversify. Ultimately, like after 3 years of hearing and being around it and seeing and just sort of understanding, it really did start to click for me. And I started actually advising on it in my financial planning practice in 2016. And so my financial planning practice has been around since 2014. So it was a couple of years before I felt comfortable enough to advise upon it. And it was only when people asked me about it, I didn't, given the rules and regulations and everything, I just didn't feel comfortable being like, hey, have you heard about this thing called
Mm.
Bitcoin? Like we do now. Now we're just like, either you have this or you go somewhere else at this point.
I'm curious, going back to like your education. So you were learning some economics and probably Keynesian in school, right? And then at the same time, you're reading more Austrian stuff. How are you reconciling both of those, or how was that? What were you thinking at that point?
Yeah, it just seemed like the stuff that we were learning in school was kind of this fake government
Mm.
like thing that we had to know. And it always seemed like we got to the point where it seemed obvious, even in Keynesian economics, that there was something wrong, but then it just was like not discussed. So, for instance, there's like in microeconomics, if you look at Keynesian microeconomics, right, they have like the charts where there's supply and demand, and then there's the tax, and then there's like the little triangle of dead weight loss. And it's just like, oh yeah, that's just kind of how it is. Like there's just this thing called dead weight loss and whatever. But they never were like, and that's bad.
Mm.
They were like, it just exists and there's nothing we can do about it. And so like when you read this stuff, you're like, okay, I mean, like obviously like we could jump to a conclusion here that like something here is off, but that conclusion was never jumped to. And so it made me interested in seeing if there was anything like anyone out there writing about the fact that that was off. And so like, I started Googling and it took me a really, really long time to actually get where I needed to go because I didn't know about Austrian economics. It wasn't like,
Mm.
oh, here, you can learn about these Keynesian people or you can learn about these Austrian people.
Yeah.
It was like, this is economics. And
Yep.
so, yeah, so it took me a while to find it. But once I did, then it was like, okay, I found all of them. You know, it was like, oh, I know this one now. And I found this one. And like, oh, and this guy wrote like some novels that are interesting, that are like anti
Hmm.
government and pro Austrian economics. And so I started reading Garrett. And like, I just got like really immersed in it. And I definitely spent more time doing that than my schoolwork. So I think my GPA could have been a little higher.
Oh, you were like actually learning, which is harder than just taking in the course load, I'm sure. So,
Yeah, for sure. And it's something that we stand by today, both my husband and I. It's that we don't let school get in the way of our education, and we certainly
mm,
aren't going to let school get in the way of our kids' education. And so,
yeah,
like, I mean, like our son goes to this like really cute, sweet school that's, you know, it's got great values and they're learning great things. But at the same time, I'm like, it's not that important. You know, it's like
I
the
know
other
it's
stuff he's going
tough.
to learn is going to be more important than this, you know?
It's tough. I have a 6 and a 4 year old, so we've got a kindergartner.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, we go through a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Like you want to make sure
That's
that your child thrives, right? But also that like they are getting like the thing that makes them tick rather than just having to do what all the other
mhm.
kids are doing simply because they can't accommodate.
I know exactly. Yes. um, okay, so yeah, so there was that 2 year window in your practice where before you started having your clients discussions with your clients about bitcoins. How did those first few discussions go?
Yeah, so I just had a client be like, my friend told me about this and he's
Hmm.
really into Bitcoin and Monero. And I was like, oh, okay, well, let's go, you know? And so we started talking about it. After the conversation, it was very clear he was going to buy Bitcoin and not Monero. And everything sort of went fine. And then I had another client, same thing. She said that one of her friends was talking to her about Bitcoin and Ethereum. And so I was like, okay, well, this is why you should only buy Bitcoin and not Ethereum. If you're gonna go out there and buy something, right? Like, let's direct you this way. And so,
Hmm.
like, my thought on it was, okay, I haven't solicited these people. They're asking me for specific advice about something. I provide specific advice. They're a client of mine, so there's nothing against me actually giving them proper advice when they're asking for it. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of how it started. And then, you know, after this 2017 run up, and you know people were asking a lot of questions during the run up at
Hmm.
the end of 2016, or sorry, at the end of 2017. It was like, should I buy this? Like, do I need this? Like, what is this? Why does this keep going up a lot and then coming back down? Like, what is this thing? And so a few more clients then got bought some Bitcoin. Some of them, unfortunately, they bought it at the top, but then they maybe bought some more as it came down. You know, so I mean, that's just the way it goes, right? And so
Hmm.
then, you know, people are silent during these bear markets for sure, and all of the questions started coming back again in 2021. But by then, we had gotten a lot of our clients invested,
Wow.
or started saving in it. A lot of our clients, really, the majority of our clients got started in 2020, I would say, and 2020 before things really started running up.
Yeah.
Just because, like, at that point, I felt enough confidence to be like, okay, this is something that people not only need, but that I feel confident advising upon, and I can actually have really good discussions with my clients about it at this point. And I felt like competent enough in enough of Bitcoin to answer all the questions that somebody would put at me. And so that made me feel confident enough to just be like, hey, like this is something that you need, and this is why you need it. And if you don't want it, fine. Like, we're not going to force you. It's your money, obviously. We're not going to use our discretion to like buy it for you, because you actually have to go and do it. You have to go buy it, and then you have to go put it somewhere. You know, it's not the same as like when you're a fiat advisor where you can just say, okay, you know, this is before the ETFs. Now I'm going to make a 5% allocation, whether people want it or not. Right? You're just
Hmm.
allocating across the board. We were having people like actually buy it and then put it in cold storage, and so
Yeah. Wow.
these were long conversations that you have to have with clients. Like, the first conversation of why you should have it, and then if after one conversation they're ready to go, right now you're having a conversation about opening an account somewhere, how to buy it, making sure they're not buying the wrong thing, funding that account. Okay, now not leaving it there. Now we have another call. Where are we moving it? How are we doing it? Setting up hardware wallets, right? It's a very long process. And so for the average advisor who has, you know, 150, 200 clients who they see once a year, right? This is just not something that they can do. But in my
Hmm.
practice, right, I have 45 clients in any given period of time. we purposely do that so that we can spend lots of high quality time with them. And if they need 7 meetings in 2 months, right, we give them 7 meetings in 2 months. And so, and if they don't need to
Hmm.
hear it from us for 6 months, that's fine too, right? And so it's just like we're in a place where we can actually do that with clients, whereas the average advisor isn't. And so I would say that definitely gave us a leg up in being able to do this. And then, I had some clients say, I just don't want it.
Hmm.
And we didn't push. And I had some other clients say I only want a little bit, and then to come back later only to say I want a little bit more, and then to come back later and say I want a little, So we had a lot of that going on too. And some people were just fine with their 3% position, and that was okay too. So I would say it was an evolution for sure. The difference really is that in 2020 I wrote a book, and it came out towards the end of the year. I started marketing that book. It's the Personal Finance Quick Start Guide. That book has a very small sliver about Bitcoin in it, about why it's important, why you should have it, and what a potential allocation could be for somebody. And when I started marketing that, just because of who I knew and all the podcast people I knew, I was able to get on Bitcoin podcasts. And so I started going on Bitcoin podcasts, and people started hearing that there's an advisor who advises
Hmm.
about Bitcoin. Oh, and so that like basically was sort of the turning point of my practice of like, okay, now people who are interested in Bitcoin come here, not
Yeah.
like, just anybody off the street anymore. It's like we're very specifically dealing with people who have Bitcoin financial planning problems.
So I'm curious, for those early people that were saying I've been told about Bitcoin and Monero or Bitcoin and Ethereum, what is your explanation? What is the difference between Bitcoin and those other ones?
Yeah, so I like to explain it to people as we're looking for a way to diversify from the money that we hold. And so in the current system, right, we live where at best we are diluted out of our money by 2% per year at best, like by
Hmm.
design. And at worst, right, it's anywhere between 3 and 30%, depending on the basket of goods and services that you're buying, right? And also that dilution is very person specific. So what Henry is buying might not be what Morgan is buying, right? And what Jane is buying might not be what Joe is buying, right? And so Jane might have a inflation rate of 30%, and Morgan might have one of 8%, and Henry might be 2% because Henry's lucky and he's only buying TVs, and and so forth. And so, right, like it's so independent, and we've seen this in my practice, especially when we have data from people who have been with me for 10 years now, right, of like how their expenses have changed over time.
Hmm.
So like it could be very personal of, hey, like we didn't even really add very much here, right? We didn't add anything, but yet groceries are up by this percent and childcare is up by this percent, and and so forth. And we can actually go down the line and calculate somebody's inflation rate just based on like a normal basket of goods that they're spending. And
Hmm.
so if you're explaining to people that, then they start to think like, oh, okay, like there's a system that's designed for me to be inflated out. And therefore I need a financial advisor to come help me invest my money so that I can like not be diluted out of my money. But that's not actually what happens, right? It's like a snap, like putting a band-aid on a cut, right? But if it needs stitches, right, the
Hmm.
wound's going to keep bleeding, but like at least it won't go on your clothes, right? That's kind of what I feel like investing is for people in fiat. It helps, yeah, and it's going to help you, maintain purchasing power over a long period of time. But now we're introducing all these other risks by having people invest rather than just save. And a lot of people actually don't want to do that. A lot of people really just want to go to work. They want to come home. They want to get their paycheck. They want to save some of it and
Yeah.
in just savings. And then they want to spend the rest of it on whatever it is that they want to do. And so for those people, right, Bitcoin is perfect because they're not actually investing in anything. They're just holding money. And so that's literally the conversation with clients. It's like, do you want to hold money or do you want to hold some like, app coin thing that,
Hmm.
like is, I guess, exciting and sexy. Some people think Ethereum is that. I think it's not, but that's besides
Hmm.
the point. But like, right, it's cool, I guess, if you want to like have a bunch of tokens, but you're not really differentiating from the fiat system, right? You're just
Yeah.
changing the third party that you're trusting to a new third party that you're trusting. And it's really the same thing with Monero, right? So that's basically the conversation. It's like there's this triangle. It's there's the transaction speed, right? There's the security of the network, and then there's the centralization, right? And there's trade-offs to all these things, right?
Hmm.
And so what Bitcoin has done, right, is they're saying, okay, security and decentralization are the two most important things, right? And we're going to sacrifice maybe on transaction speed or the amount of transactions that can happen at any given period of time, right? Block size, to make sure
Hmm.
that that there's no centralization at any given period of time, and that there's the most security that there possibly can be. There's no other coin that's doing that, right? Other coins are optimizing for features, right? And so, or transactions, right? And you can include features in there of like, okay, if I want to have these different features, now I am risking maybe security or centralization. And so, and then also, right, obviously, like behind the scenes, if you're doing proof of work versus proof of stake, as soon as you're proof of stake, you're centralized. I mean, that's just the way it is. And there's been papers on it about in order
Yeah.
to secure those networks and make them decentralized, they actually have to use Bitcoin as a way of like coming back to decentralization. And so, right, that makes that coin basically obsolete if they have to use Bitcoin. If you're already using Bitcoin, then just use Bitcoin, right? Like you don't
Hmm.
need this other coin. So
Hmm.
it's for most people, right? If you're just sort of explaining it on their level of what is relevant to them, then they're going to get it and they're going to want some.
So what, as you're kind of onboarding your clients to Bitcoin, first through them asking you, then sort of um, you discussing it with them, and then finally Bitcoin clients coming to you, I suppose. But in the first two phases, um, what what was being replaced in their portfolios for Bitcoin? I'm sure it's personal to everybody, but generally, like what were you wanting to kick out to put some Bitcoin in?
Yeah, it's going to be really dependent on client portfolios, but on
Hmm.
average, it was either being taken from a stock position or a bond position for the most part.
Hmm.
Most people don't just have a lot of cash lying around that they're like ready to deploy into new cash, right? Bitcoin instead. And so we have to sell something. So for some people, right, depending on their risk tolerance, it's going to mean that we're selling stocks to do it. If for other people, it's going to mean that we're selling bonds. We're going to take taxes into account as well on this. So
Hmm.
somebody who has, let's say low basis positions, maybe it doesn't make sense to sell that, pay taxes, and to go buy Bitcoin, right? Or maybe we sell a portion of it and we use something that has a lower taxable gain on it. And so it's really, really client dependent. But I would say it's also going to depend on whether or not somebody is living off their assets, right? Or if they're accumulating. If people are accumulating, then it's very easy to just you don't need things like bonds in your portfolio. And so for a lot of our clients, right, most of our clients, I mean, almost none of our clients have any kind of long term bonds, anyways. A lot of our clients
Mm.
do hold short term bonds, but the reason why is either to balance out the asset allocation for whatever reason, or because they have some sort of short-term need for fiat cash that Bitcoin actually can't do, right? Bitcoin is long-term savings. It's not good as short-term savings. And so for those people
Uh,
who are accumulating, but they're also accumulating to spend it in the next, 1 to 5 years, right? That's going to be instead of a short-term bond portfolio, in which case, right, if we actually need that money, that's not what we would be selling in order to buy Bitcoin, right? We would be selling the money that we don't need to put it into Bitcoin because we don't need Bitcoin for a long period of time. So that's kind of how I like to think about it. In CFA terms, that would be called that's asset liability matching is kind of the fancy term for it of like you take an asset and you match it with a liability. And so for long-term liabilities like, retirement or student loan debt that's coming due or something like that, these long-term or child's education, right? Like Bitcoin is going to be appropriate long-term asset, but buying a house in the next 1 to 3 years, right? Bitcoin's totally inappropriate for that, and that wouldn't be the asset
mm,
that you would match with that liability.
gotcha. Yeah. Um, so obviously, every client you work with is totally customized to their goals and life and income and savings and all of that. But it sounds like pretty much all of your clients have Bitcoin. So how does this one asset fit with such a diverse group of people? How does it fit into sort of every portfolio?
Yeah, so for some people, like it's just an insurance policy, right? Okay, the world seems like it's kind of on fire, and maybe it's totally on fire, and maybe this is like how the fire gets put out is by having a currency that we can opt out with. In which case, right, if you're using it as an insurance policy, it's going to be a lower portion of your portfolio because if that's all you see it as, it's like okay, just in case I need to have this thing, then we have to say how much of your portfolio, like how much do we need to allocate here to protect you rather than how much are we allocating here because you simply don't want to be part of this fiat system anymore. You only want to have long-term savings and maybe short-term savings, right? Or you want to have long-term savings and some, long-term fiat stuff happening. But for the most part, right, like the majority of your portfolio is in Bitcoin. And so it's going to be really client dependent in that
Hmm.
regard. But that's kind of how I'm balancing is like we're just looking at the client situation, how Bitcoin fits specifically with them, how well they understand the technology, what their risk tolerance is, what their unique situation is, what their time horizon is for any of their assets in general, and then we're making a determination based on that. And what we found though is that over time, people just want to have more of their assets in savings and not in investment, because they don't want the risks associated with being involved in an investment. And ultimately, right, the goal of holding Bitcoin is not that you convert back to fiat. The goal of Bitcoin is that it becomes a usable money in the future that people are actually transacting in, and people are already transacting in it today. So, imagine what 15, 20, 30 years from now is going to look like. And the median age of my practice is, 45. And so for a lot of people, right, it is really feasible that they can hold this asset for the next 20 years and be using it in retirement as like the only thing that they're using.
Mm.
And so, right, the goal is to get there for a lot of people. And if that's the case, right, it's going to be a much larger portion of their portfolio because they just want to be holding money. They don't want to be holding investments.
Wow. Yeah. So that brings me to something I definitely wanted to ask you, because you guys are essentially a Bitcoin family. So do you measure your like family assets in Bitcoin or in dollars or both? And then do you want to end up with more Bitcoin or more dollars at the end? Like, how do you view that, since you guys are so deep into Bitcoin?
Yeah. So, I mean, without like, doxing our financial situation here, I mean,
Yeah,
basically
sorry.
what how I'm looking at it for, myself or really clients in general, right, is we're generally still looking at things in fiat terms because everything is still in fiat, right? Like
Hmm.
I don't do a whole lot in my life in just Bitcoin. And I
Yeah.
don't know that many people do. I do know some people who have decided that, they're going to only live on Bitcoin, right? And I would say from an accounting perspective, I've heard about what they're doing and it seems like a nightmare to me, but it seems like they're enjoying it, and
Mm.
who am I to say that, like, who am I to be the wet blanket about that? But for me personally, that's just not, I don't think it's really all that practical. And so because things are still in fiat terms, I'm still looking at things in fiat terms. That
Yep.
said, when they're not in fiat terms anymore, it's not going to make sense for me to look at things in fiat terms, in which case, yeah, of
Yeah.
course we're going to switch our unit of account. But I don't think we're there yet. And I don't think that
Yeah.
means that we won't ever be there. I just think that, that's something we need to evaluate on a yearly basis.
Yeah. That sounds pretty practical. Um, you've done some research recently on retirement planning, so I'm curious to know what you found out and on that project.
Yeah, definitely. So there is something in the fiat financial world called the Trinity Study, and so the Trinity Study was done by a guy named Bill Bengen, and basically what he came up with was that if you have a 50% stock, 50% bond portfolio, and you withdraw 4% every single year, you will basically be able to have your portfolio live on for 30 plus years, and you won't run out of money. And so the 4% safe withdrawal rate is one of these like very standard numbers that people use for retirement planning. And if you're going to retirement plan for long periods of time, right? Obviously, if somebody retires at the age of 80, right, you probably maybe don't need a 30-year time horizon, in
Hmm.
which case you would use a higher withdrawal rate and so forth. But 4% is typically what people think of. When people are retiring much younger than I would say a normal retirement age, we should actually try to look at like between 3 and 3.5% just to make sure the money lasts for a really long time. But this is sort of like how I went into doing my retirement planning research for Bitcoin. Why I'm like giving you this backstory is that I just thought, okay, let's find out what's a safe withdrawal rate in Bitcoin. And so after
Hmm.
doing like crazy amounts of math and calculations, like literally like so many different things, and like running different portfolios and trying to figure this out of like what's the safe withdrawal rate, I finally had this haha moment of like, Bitcoin is not a compounding asset.
Hmm.
Like it's a fixed asset. So you
Hmm.
just divide it by a number and that's how much Bitcoin you can spend. It's like, it's so simple.
Yeah.
It changes retirement planning completely, right? So obviously if you live in this nice Bitcoin
Wow.
world where, I spend zero point 0.1 Bitcoin per year, right? Then, okay, this is how much I need to retire, and so forth. And everything's great. We don't live in that world though yet, right? So
Hmm.
like there's still some financial planning that needs to happen to decide how much Bitcoin would be appropriate to withdraw and so forth, and how you would handle actually what happens in like from a financial planning perspective to make sure that you have enough runway to last the volatility, right? Because like, let's say you're at the peak in 2021, right? And you're like, okay, I have enough to retire now, and I'm going to take my 1 Bitcoin out per year or whatever it is,
Yeah.
but then Bitcoin crashes, and now you're like, I can still only take out 1 Bitcoin per year, but now I can spend 85% less, right? It's a very different
Hmm.
picture. And so basically, while we're still living in this fiat world, what I actually think makes sense for people and what people aren't going to really want to do, but what they're going to have to do would be that you sell 5 years worth of Bitcoin, keep it in fiat so that you can actually
Hmm.
literally retire whenever you hit that price target. So like if somebody's price target is 700,000
Oh, wow.
K for Bitcoin, I know I can retire. Then when we hit 700,000 K, okay, now I sell 5 years worth of expenses. That's going to be, I think, super difficult for people. It's like going to be
Oh,
one of the
wow.
hardest things is going to be to actually pull the trigger on that kind of stuff. But the math actually says that that's what you're supposed to do.
Wow.
And so I found that all to be really interesting because it's like I'm sitting here at a spreadsheet like, oh, maybe it's a 10% withdrawal rate, It's like
Yeah.
it's not. It's like actually 2% or less depending on your lifespan. I mean,
Crazy.
obviously, like if you're 90 and if you want to plan to age 100, right, your withdrawal rate is going to look very different than somebody who's like I'm 35 and going to retire. And all of the withdrawal rates I based off of like 100-year lifespan so that people can outlive their money. But again, right, if you live
Hmm.
to be 120, you actually run out of Bitcoin, and if you live to be 80, then you have significantly more Bitcoin left over. And so like getting that
Hmm.
actuarial assumption more like correct is actually going to be more meaningful in a Bitcoin world.
Wow. So I may have missed this, but is the 5-year thing to reduce the volatility of the 4-year cycle? Is that like getting over that hump? Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
like, okay, if there are 4-year cycles in Bitcoin, then you would want to have at least 5 years worth of runway. If you really wanted to be
Mm.
safe, you would actually do more like 8 years worth of spending. And you would have to like calculate an inflation rate in there too, obviously, to make sure that
Hmm.
you were keeping up with fiat inflation over that time. But yeah.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's after all that research, it becomes so simple in the end, right? It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah. It really was like why I named the article, Does Bitcoin Make Retirement Planning Obsolete? It's like, because, yeah, it's like
Mm.
everything is more simple with Bitcoin. Like every time we do anything with it, when it's complicated, right, is like interfacing Bitcoin with the fiat world makes it complicated and makes me still have a job. But really, what I think is going to happen is that most people are actually not going to need financial planning and will be able to do their financial planning on the back of a postcard or whatever. And then the people who really do have complicated financial planning problems will come to people like me. And there will still be a need for that in the future for sure. But like the average person will actually just be able to do this on their own. And honestly, like that's great. That's like the ideal world, is that people who just live normal lives can actually do their own financial planning.
Right, because it's back to work and save instead of work and save and invest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then putting all these
it's crazy.
assumptions on what you need and what inflation's going to be, and like what is
Hmm.
like all the different inflation rates that you have to be thinking about, like from healthcare to schooling to whatever else is in your life, right? All of these things have different higher inflation rates that you have to put on things, and then project out what you think you need, and then bring it back to today's dollars, and then adding in how much you're saving along the way. I mean, there's a lot of complicated stuff that goes into. It's not complicated, but it's like there are a lot of moving parts that people aren't thinking about when they're doing this kind of planning work. And it's something that's sort of second nature to financial planners like me, but it shouldn't have to be that way, right? The average
Hmm.
person should just be able to work, figure out what an appropriate savings rate is, and then say, okay, now that I have, 6 Bitcoin, I could retire. Um,
Hmm.
instead of being like, can I retire? They're like, what kind of math do I need to do? Do I need to hire a person? Yeah.
Yeah.
That sort of a thing. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, looking way out into the future, potentially Bitcoin could replace gold, right? So like a global store of value. It could become the global reserve currency, global reserve asset, but all of those are at much, much higher prices or market caps than today. So short of that, there's obviously risk. So like, what are the risks in Bitcoin? If this whole plan were to blow up, what do you think would have caused that? What are the risks to Bitcoin you see?
So I don't see it as risks to Bitcoin in the long term. I see it as short term risks to Bitcoin, of like, not that Bitcoin goes away, but that it just takes a lot longer to materialize than people think that it
Hmm.
will. And so, right, the fiat on and off ramps are the easiest thing to tackle. Right. If the US government actually wanted to shut this down, what they do is they say, okay, now we make it illegal for anyone to use an exchange. And if we see you using an exchange, because we have full control over your bank accounts, we will tell that bank to kick you out and shut you down. Right. And
Hmm.
they've done some of that, obviously, but they haven't really done that on a wide scale. I think that would probably be the max of what they'd be able to do. I mean, short of them kicking down people's doors and actually lifting people's hardware wallets, which I think would be very unpalatable and un-American, to be honest, without warrants and so forth, seizing people's Bitcoin, right? People are still going to
Hmm.
actually own this asset, right? It's just going to be hard for them to maybe do anything in it until like, there's some sort of reform that happens. And so I think that does mean, right, that things like exchanges go abroad, right, instead of here. And then
Yeah.
maybe there are risks to like US clients actually being able to buy it abroad. There's probably going to be something like local Bitcoins that makes a comeback where people are actually, meeting places and exchanging, right? There's going to be some sort of black market. I would assume that would happen.
Hmm.
Same thing with businesses, right? Businesses who were accepting it before, maybe they don't publicize that they're doing it anymore, but like people who know, they know, like I
Yeah.
feel like there's going to be a lot of that going on.
Wow.
And so I don't think it kills Bitcoin, right? But I do think that it makes it very, very difficult for it to proliferate at the rate that it currently has been doing. But I think that some of these things are also unpalatable here, right? I mean, if we start sending all of these jobs, like mining jobs abroad and exchange jobs abroad and everything else that's going on in the community, all of this stuff will eventually go abroad just because, like, even if everyone bans it, El Salvador still has it as their currency, right? And so it all goes there, right? It's not like everyone on earth is saying, okay, Bitcoin's over. It's just going to be a
Yeah.
few elite countries basically who are going to decide that Bitcoin is over. And we've seen this in China, right? China is now on like what, their sixth or seventh Bitcoin ban, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they just cannot ban this thing. So
Yeah.
if China can't
Yeah.
do it and they have way more control over their people than here, then, I don't
Hmm.
see it as possible here. I do see it as maybe slowing, but not that Bitcoin goes away. So for most people, though, that just means you have to be more patient than you think you have to be, and you do have to keep your savings rates higher than people are saying. Because, right, like the average Bitcoiner maybe thinks that we're going to a million during the next run, in which case, if Bitcoin goes to a million, I only need, half a Bitcoin, or, whatever it is that they need, right? In
Yeah.
which case, they don't think that they have to save, and then they're still living their fiat lifestyle and so forth. And so I would still say use traditional rules of thumbs to help you during this transitional time, right? Of, okay, it's still proper to save 20% or more of your pre-tax income every single year, no matter what, right? If you want to save it in Bitcoin, great. But like
Hmm.
these are steps that you need to be taking so that you are appropriately saving, so that should this take longer than everybody thinks it will, that you actually have something to live on later.
Hmm. So if we zoom out and Bitcoin becomes what you think it will, or maybe it already is, but if everyone figures it out and switches over in the future, I'm really curious to hear your take on like generationally how this changes things. So first, like, what did the baby boomers invest in and get wealthy on? What will the millennials invest in if Bitcoin's kind of growing up through this generation? Then what do you think our kids investing life will look like if Bitcoin is continuing to go on this path?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, my best hope for the future is that we use something like Bitcoin, that my kids are using that, and that they don't actually have to invest unless there's an actual
Hmm.
opportunity for investment. So people often think that you need
Yeah,
to
I probably
invest.
asked the wrong word. I actually said the
Yeah.
wrong word. Sorry.
Yeah,
You're
like
right.
that you have to, like, oh, we have to invest because that's the only way. And it's like, no, we invest because there's an opportunity to invest. And we
Hmm.
are so far from that world of like investing because there's an actual opportunity, like doing a Benjamin Graham style, evaluation of a company and saying, actually, this is undervalued. It would be worth me putting my money at, like we just
Hmm.
don't do that kind of stuff anymore. Obviously, there are people who are doing that or pretending to do that, but like the metrics that they're using at this point are so far from
Hmm.
what those traditional metrics used to be. And obviously those metrics are going to change over time if like this money is deflationary, right? And then people are having to decide whether or not it even makes any sense to give a business capital, in which case it's like, okay, that business has to actually be very valuable. And so like that's kind of where I see this going in the future, is that not so many people are making investment decisions. But as far as like multi-generational wealth, I'm kind of mixed on it. And you would think I wouldn't be as a financial advisor, but I'm also I'm a devout Jewish woman, and I do believe that I believe this, and people are fair to disagree with me here, but I think that God gives you what you have, and that he gives it to you. He doesn't give it, if he didn't want you to have it, he would have given it to somebody else. And so I think it's really important that we make good decisions with what we are given in life, and that we use that money properly. And so that probably doesn't mean that you're leaving your kids with massive inheritances, because if you are, then like God would have given it to your kids and not to you, right? You're a
Oh.
steward of that wealth. And so it's like, how are you using it? How are you benefiting the world with it? How are you changing your community with it? How are you, I don't know, helping, like in my case, right, like bringing God's world and light into the world. And
Mhm.
so like that's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. And I've changed my views on this for sure over time. And obviously, I know how to do multi-generational wealth planning. We help people with that all the time. And I'm even mixed on my own situation about whether or not that would make sense for my kids, like how much we give them versus how much,
Yeah.
other causes and things get. But at the end of the day, right, it's a decision obviously people have to make of, okay, how much really do you want to help your kids, versus how much
Yeah.
should they really be kind of bootstrapping it on their own. And what we've actually found in my practice through the small amount of research and clients that we have is that generally people do better when their parents don't give them so much. And especially when parents, if they are going to give it, that they don't put so many strings on it. And so what we found is like the trust that people inherit when they have less stipulations, the kid has more freedom and responsibility, right? And therefore
Mhm.
they actually take responsibility of those assets. Whereas when the parents are really trying to protect their kid from themselves and therefore being like, okay, you get a little bit at 30 and a little bit at 35, and all they do this every 5 years up to 65 to make sure that this trust lasts. And then you're like, okay, now
Oh,
you
wow.
have like a 65-year-old kid. Like, are you proud of yourself?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
would say, like, from that perspective, we do advise clients that they should be really as lenient as possible. And clients don't like to hear
Mhm.
that because they're like, well, I worked really hard for this. And then, like, my kid's just going to blow it. And you're like, yeah, they blow it. And then they have to figure it out. Isn't it better that your kid figures it out rather than them just being like infantile for 65 years? And usually people agree that, right, they'd rather their child be resilient and responsible and figure it out than a child
Mhm.
who's just like so dependent on a trust that they don't know what else to do with their life.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. Well, Morgan, I really appreciate you coming on today. Where would you want to send people? I know you have a number of podcasts. You've got your book. You've got businesses. Tell me a couple places, and I'll be sure to include the links.
Yeah, definitely. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Morgan with an E, Rochard. And I have two businesses. My financial planning practice is originwa.com. It's for Origin Wealth Advisors. And then I have a consulting practice where if you just got a bunch of Bitcoin questions and you want to get them answered, you can go over there. I can't give investment advice there, but that's moneyowners.com. And it's just hourly planning. So you just go on there, schedule, pay, we talk, that's it. And yeah, my husband and I have a podcast. It's called Bitcoin for Advisors. So you should check that out. I don't really run my Money Owners podcast anymore, to be honest. I got so used to
Mm.
talking to Pierre that it's actually, and going on podcasts like yours, that I actually find it hard for me to talk to myself now. So maybe one day I'll revive that. But in the meantime,
Yeah.
yeah, we do our best to get those out monthly. But honestly, it's been a while for us. We know one is due. So we'll do our best to get one of those out soon.
Thanks so much, Morgan.
Thanks for having me on.